Now let's start setting up a few things. So we actually talked about the fact that inside our MVC architecture, so let's see if I'm able to open, not this, but if I'm able to open the same diagram. So if you guys carefully remember, then we actually had a very in-depth discussion about the overall high-level controller and the model layer, that in the modern new MVC, how things should be segregated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from here. We need kind of like a routing layer, right? If you remember, what was the purpose of this routing layer? The only purpose of this routing layer was to map the HTTP method and the URL route that are supported in our app. So inside this routing layer, we mentioned all of those routes, their route URL, their route method that are supported by our application. Okay. Currently, if you remember, like whatever knowledge you have for Express.js, how do you do that? Let's say I want to expose a URL like /API/v1/ping, right? We do it like this. We use the Express app object, right? We call app.get and then put a URL here. We put a URL here. And then corresponding to this, we put a callback function. If you remember, this callback function has a request object and a response object. Okay, cool. So we'll start from here and we'll try to understand what's going on. Okay. So this part is actually the URL mapping, right? This part is the URL mapping. This URL, then that when you say app.get, this is the URL, this is the URL mapping. And what this URL is getting mapped to, if you remember, after the routing layer, there was a validation layer that whatever request object is incoming, we actually validate whether it is present or not. But for the moment, just assume that we don't need any validation, because let's say if you remember, in the ping request, we don't send any request body, right? So we don't need any validation. That means this validation layer can be skipped and we will directly land up at the controller layer. So from the routing layer, we land up at the controller layer. What is a controller? This is the layer for which, like from which the request goes to the service layer, and the responsibility of this layer is to prepare the response object as well. So what happens is when you actually hit a route, this controller layer is kind of like the first line of defense, right? This controller layer is the first line of defense. Now you pause yourself here and think about, this is the route, this is the HTTP method. Can I say that this route and method that makes the routing layer is mapped to this function? It is mapped to this function. Can I say that anybody, if they will make a request here, I'm going to call this function. Can I say that? Right? If anyone is going to make a call to /API/v1/ping with a get request, I'm going to call this function. So can I say this URL plus method is mapped to this callback function? Can I say that? Right? So technically, this URL plus HTTP method is your routing layer, and this callback is your controller layer, right? This is actually your controller callback, right? That's why you are able to do something like this, right? Response.json message alive, right? Something like this. Okay. You can say return response.json. Okay. And now if you do npm start, and let's say if I open Postman, right? Let's wait for a minute. Just a moment, guys. Okay. So let's remove this. What I'll do is I'll create a new collection for ShopCart Express backend, and here I will add a request. Okay, so we are going to make a request on localhost 3001 slash API slash v1 slash ping. This is the request that we are going to make. And if I send this request, can you see we are getting message alive, right? We are getting message alive. Okay, cool. Now what's happening? Let's try to understand the flow here. When you make a GET request to this URL and send it, what happens is your Express server is up and you have a mapping inside your project that at any point of time inside this Express app, if a request comes to slash API slash v1 slash ping with a GET request, that request should be mapped to this callback function. And if you remember, and if there is a validation, we can add some validation. I'll show you how you can add some validations for a moment. But let's say we don't need any validation here, right? So if you don't need a validation layer can be skipped. So this is the routing part, which maps your route to this callback function, which is a controller function, right? This is actually your controller. And now if you want to segregate it out into separate folders, this is going to be not that of a difficult task, right? So let's see something. How can we do it? I'll first of all tell you the simple way, and then I will tell you the recommended way. So I'll create a new folder, controllers. Okay, I'll create a new folder, controllers. Inside the controller folder, I will say, let's say ping controller.js. Okay, and now here I don't have to do much. I'll write a function ping controller. It will have a request object, it will have a response object, and let's say I'll say return response.json message. Okay, right? Let's say something like this. So what I've done is I've created a new folder. Inside that new folder, I created a new file. Inside that file, I have a function. Now what I'm going to do is I'll say module.exports ping controller. Okay, I'm going to export this function. So here you can see I'm not writing key value pair. So if you don't write the key value pair and just write the name of the function, then the key will become the name of the function and value will become the function. And now let's say here, instead of doing something like this, how about instead of passing the callback here, I say const require slash controller slash ping controller, and inside ping controller we say ping controller. Okay, and I pass this method directly here. Now see what's happening. Previously I hard coded, or I would say inside my server file only, I put this request, or I would say the route, and corresponding to the route I mapped it with a controller function. Now all I have done is that I have moved my controller to a new file and exported the controller from there, and now I am using it. So it should not be anything amusing to you. I'm just modularizing my code. I'm segregating out my code into multiple modules so that every module is kind of like independent of each other. And you can see server restarted itself. If you make a request, see message OK is coming. Message OK means we are returning it from ping controller. So you can see it's that easy to make a new layer. So you can see you have a controller layer ready with you. You have a controller layer ready with you. Now any controller that you have to bring, you'll just create a new controller file. Inside that controller file, there will be a bunch of controller functions, and you can just export those functions. As simple as that. Now having said that, now just think about it. Now let's say we want a routing layer as well. So the first step that we should do is let's create a new folder, routes. Now technically this mapping, because just think about it. If you have a very big app, something at a scale of Flipkart or something, inside my index.js file, which is my actual server file, which is initiating the server, getting some port configurations and everything. If let's say we have a very big app like Flipkart, maybe we need tens of thousands of APIs. do you think will we just we will keep on writing APIs like this? Like in the same file, we'll be just adding app.get, app.post, app.this, app.that? No. If let's say we have 1000 APIs altogether, this whole file will be absolutely unmanageable, right? That's why we need what? We need routes. Okay, separate routes. We need separate routes. Okay, so route should not directly exist inside your server file. They should be separated out inside a routes folder. And inside that folder, we will write the logic so that this route gets mapped to this controller. So you can see we are doing logic segregation. We are doing separation of concerns, that all the code inside the routes file is just for mapping the routes. All the codes in the controller file is to write the controller for that corresponding code, right? You'll understand the essence of reusability in some time. But for the time being, in order to manage routes, now I would like to ask you guys a question. Now I showed you how to segregate out the controller. Okay. Now let's say you want to segregate out the ping routes. You want to segregate out the ping routes. So let's say I'll create a new file, ping routes. Now, if you carefully see, to map a route, this is what? Mapping a route to a controller, right? This mapping of a route should be happening inside the ping routes, right? This mapping of route should be happening inside the ping routes. Okay. If you carefully see, to map this route, we need the Express app object that we created in the server file. See, we do app.get. That means what is the app? App is the Express app object. So we need the access to the Express app object in this file also. One solution is what? You need the access of the Express app object inside this file, right? Somehow, let's say, maybe we write a function, config routes. It takes an app object, and let's say we write something like this. Copy paste. Okay. And let's say we do something like module.exports config routes. Okay. And we will call it as, let's say, config ping routes. Okay. And then let's say I'll import it, const require ping routes. And now what is ping route returning you? It's returning your function. If you call the function, and you pass the Express app object, you will call this line, right? So let's say instead of doing this, I call config ping routes and I pass the app object, and I pass the app object altogether. Okay, let's restart. Okay, now we don't need this ping controller here. We need to pass it here. Right, my bad. We need to pass it here. Okay. See, now the server is up. So what happened? This API route is mapped to ping controller. So I'm importing the ping controller. Okay. And now if I save it, you can see this is up. And now if I make a request, can you see request is working? No problem at all. So this is one solution. Like this is my one solution, that now let's say there are more ping routes. App.post some URL, and then you want to map it to some controller, right? So all of those one type of routes. For example, let's say after some time, let's say you have a product routes that you can get get a product, get all products, create a product, delete a product, update a product, all of these things. So we can make a product routes.js and add all of those product related routes inside that particular file and wrap those routes inside a function. That function takes an Express app object, and then you call that function from here. All of this definitely looks very fascinating and very simple, but I believe there is still a problem. Why? The problem is that there will be, let's say if you have 40-50 entities inside your overall app, then there will be 40-50 function calls, and inside each function call you're passing the Express app object. That's a bit problematic, right? Because again, it will bloat the whole file with irrelevant content. So this is not the solution that we want to look for. So now I want you guys to pause yourself here and think about, if you have to segregate out the routes inside Express.js, what's the best practice? Is there any already prepared solution available, or you have to do everything from scratch, just like how you did it for controller? You have to write it from scratch. Think about it. Now to solve this problem of routing, Express actually provides us a very elegant solution, right? This solution is actually called as Express router. Okay, so if you go to Express routing, right, routing refers to how an application endpoints respond to client requests. What are the endpoints? One of the endpoints that we have here is, let's say, /API/UN/ping, right? This is kind of like an endpoint with a GET request. Okay, cool. So you can see this is your basic routing kind of mechanism. Okay, this is a GET request, this is a POST request, so on and so forth. Now, if you go down, okay, and if you go here, there is an article on Express router. Now, what is Express router? Express router class, or you can say use the Express router class to create modular mountable route handlers. And can I say this was our agenda, that we wanted to make modular code? When we segregated out controllers in a separate folder here, what was the agenda? The agenda was to make modular code. The agenda was to make clean code. And can you see, if you want modularity inside your, I would say, routes, then Express router is a fantastic solution for that. How exactly Express router works, let me show you. So router instance is a complete middleware and a routing system. Okay. For this reason, it is also referred as a mini app. Okay. I'll talk about middlewares, don't worry. But let's see an example. Okay. So you can see that they are asking us to create a router file with the name birds.js. Okay, we will create it. They are taking the Express module, and instead of calling the Express module directly, you can see here inside index.js, I call the Express function directly. Instead of calling that, we call express.router. We call express.router, and we get a router object. Now, instead of doing app.get, that was the Express app.get, app.post, we do router.get, something like this. Okay, forget about this router.use for a moment, but you can see instead of app.get, what was the app object? App object was the Express app object. This is not an Express app object. This is a Express router object. So you can say that using the router also, we are able to configure all of our routes, just like we were doing app.get, app.post. Here also we can do it. And then from this birds.js file, they are returning the router object. Now this is an interesting part. Now the router object that we created and we configured a bunch of URLs, we are returning that router object. And now wherever we have to load this router, where do we have to load this router? Inside my server file. What I'm doing is I'm requiring that file. Which file? This file is getting required, right? And then we are calling app.use. What is this app? This is the Express app object. App.use/birds, and we are mapping this /birds to the birds router. What is this bird? This is the birds router. So what's happening is that at any point of time, if your Express app object detects that there is an incoming URL on /birds, that is someone is making a request on localhost 3000/birds, what it will do is it will map this URL, everything, a get request, post request, put request, patch request, any request for this URL to this router object. Okay, because internally what router object does is it internally configures all the API requests and their responses like this. Get request on a /, get request on a /about, what should be the response, things like that. So router object already knows that if I get a request on /, what should I do? If I get a request on /about, what should I do? And now I'm saying that if anybody makes a request on slash birds, then I'm going to call this router. Okay, so think about it like this. If somebody made a request on slash birds, nothing else, just slash birds, what will happen is this function will be called. If let's say it's a get request on slash birds. Why? Because what you are saying is that any request that starts with slash birds, if that request comes to us, doesn't matter the HTTP method. If any request starts with slash birds and it comes to us, we are going to map that request to this express router object. What will happen is inside the express router object, after slash birds, we will check after slash bird, do we have a slash? Yes. So this function will be called. For example, if somebody calls for slash birds slash about. So can I say this URL starts with a slash birds? If that's the case, then the birds router will be actually mapped. And now inside the birds router, we are going to look for the remaining routes. What is the remaining route? Slash about. So we'll see, is there any slash about? Yes, this is the slash about, and we are going to send the response. So how things are working is that you might be having very complex set of, I would say, URL. So let's say you have a URL like slash bird slash about. So if this URL starts with slash bird, you map it to the express router. Now inside that express router, we search for the remaining URL. Think about it like this. If we had a request like just slash birds, if we had a request like slash birds, what happens? We come here, we see, oh, slash birds is mapped to this birds object or birds router object. We go here. Inside this file, we search for the remaining URL. What is the remaining URL here? Nothing. Nothing is the remaining URL. That's why you actually hit this request. But let's say if somebody makes a get request on slash bird slash about. So again, the URL starts with slash birds. We will check, oh, slash birds has been mapped with a birds router object, right? And then inside this file, we are going to search for, okay, after birds, do we have whatever we have? Is this present in that file? So after birds, what do we have? About. Do we have a route on slash about? Yes. So we redirect all of those requests here. This is the power of Express router. Let me show you this actually in action. So what we should do is, instead of passing app object like this, what we will do is we'll come here. We don't need this. We don't need this. Okay. We'll say const express is equals to require express. And I'll create a router object. Const router is equals to express dot router. Okay, we have a router object. And I'll put this import above. And now instead of doing app.get, I do router.get. And I export my router object altogether. Can you guys see? Same thing that they were doing for birds, I'm doing it here. Same thing that they are doing for birds, I'm doing it here. Right? And let's say I will make this URL as slash. So you can see this looks like the birds router, right? That we have the router object. We say router.get on a slash should be called to ping controller. And now inside my server file, we will say app.use. So at any point of time, if somebody made a request on slash API slash v1 slash ping, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say const, you can say ping routes is equals to require route slash ping routes. Okay. And then you can do app.use ping routes, as simple as that. And if you remember, something like this is done in the birds example here as well. That here you do app.use with some URL, you mark the express router. So here you can see slash API slash v1 slash ping, right? We mark the ping routes. And the moment you are inside ping routes, we will check for, is there anything else remaining that is present as a routing? Yes, just slash is remaining. So this ping controller will be triggered. You can see the server is already up, right? And now if I make a request, can you see the request works absolutely fine. And this is definitely a very, very nice and easy way to actually handle your routes. I'll do more cleanup here, but I believe the basic concept of Express router is clear to you. That Express router actually helps you to create custom routes and then return it. And then it actually, you can say, injects itself with the Express app object. So instead of passing your Express app object in different files, which is roaming around here and there, this is a far more elegant solution. So I'll just push it up. Added basic Express router. Here we go. So just to revise what we have already discussed is that, let's say at any point of time, let me draw a diagram so that you guys can understand it well, right? So let's assume something like this, okay? So generally what happens is that if you see any of your URLs, okay, if you see any of your URLs, your URL might look like something like this, slash posts, right? Or let's do something like this, slash users, slash account, okay, something like this, okay? Now if this is your route, currently what will happen is, if you will not implement Express router, then you will do something like this, app.get slash users slash account, and then we'll put a, let's say, controller, some controller function, right? This will be the situation. But now if you will do something like this, then if the app grows, then there will be a lot of routes that will be just directly present here. That will not make any sense. So what we do is, we say that, okay, let's do one thing. We can create an object. That's an Express router object. This is a Express router object, okay? What Express router object helps you to do is, this Express router object helps you to actually configure routes. For example, something like this, see, just like how you were configuring the routes directly with the app object, you can configure it with the router objects as well. Now you will think that what's the benefit? We were doing app.get, now we are doing router.get, router.post, router.get, right? So the benefit is that, see, so now you say that if any request comes on slash users, okay, so let's say if any request comes with URL starting from slash users, okay, if any request comes from the URL starting with slash users, right, let's do something like this. Okay, then what we are going to do is, we are going to return a special router object. See, any request, if it starts with slash users, the prefix is slash users, then we are going to redirect all of those requests to a Express router object. Think like this. So I'll turn up the server, okay, and here let's say I will say that if any request comes up, let's remove this, if any request comes to slash users, let's say if any request comes to slash users, I am going to call my ping routes. Inside the ping routes, I have created a router object, right? Now any request that starts with slash users, is going to be handled by this file. But inside this file also, we can have multiple routes. Let's say router.get slash account, right? We can have multiple routes here as well, in this file as well. Can I say that? Which route is something that we are targeting? So now we said that if something starts with slash users, we say app.use slash users. That means if any incoming request is coming with the starting of the URL as slash users, we call ping routes. And then we see the remaining route, the remaining URL. Now currently there is nothing in the remaining URL. So what will happen is, it will be redirected to this particular router. Okay. Then if let's say you make a call to /user/account. So after users, what is the remaining URL? The remaining URL is /account. The remaining URL is /account. So you will check, do we have any URL for /account? Yes. So you can see router.get /account. Right. So now if you will make this request, can you see we are getting still the correct response, right? But let's say if we try to make a call to /accounts, you see we are getting 404 because after /users, when the request for /users came, we went to the ping routes. There is nothing /accounts, right? There is no route with /accounts. That is the problem that exists, right? And that's how Express router actually helps you to solve it. So I'll bring it back in the original way. So what originally I wrote is this, that if any route starts with /API /v1/ping, any route starts with this, then I'm going to call to ping routes. And then I'm going to see the remaining route. If the remaining route has nothing, then I'm going to call this ping controller. Right. Now just think about it. We say API /v1/ping. Okay. What is this ping routes? What is this ping routes? So for a better naming, you can even say ping router. You can say ping router. What is this ping router? Ping router is this router object. See, so we configure the routes and we export the router object. So inside the ping routes, we have configured all the routes, right? And we are going to return this router object. This router object you can pass here in app.use. Okay. So there is a concept of middlewares. I'm going to come to middlewares, but for the timing, try to understand the syntax that we created a router object. In that router object, we configured the URL and we exported the router object. Here, whatever prefix URL you want to map the router with, you mention that prefix URL and this router will be mapped. So that any request, if it starts with this, will be mapped to this particular router. Now let's try to clean things up a bit more. Now, what is the use of this /API /v1/ping? Let's go one by one. Now, can I say that this v1 represents API versioning? Currently, we have v1 API. That is our initial API. Maybe this API is not the fastest implementation of our logic, but it still gets the work done. And we anticipate that in the next 2 years, we are going to release the version 2 of the API, which will be slightly even better. Think about it like ChatGPT. When you started using ChatGPT, I guess it was ChatGPT 3 or 3.5. Later, ChatGPT released the model 4. That was ChatGPT version 4. Right. So different version of the APIs of ChatGPT were released. Similarly, you have to do maybe something like this as well. So you can get a case that some request might come to /API /v1/ping. Some request might come to /API /v2/ping. Right? Because now let's say you have a set of version 1 of some APIs and you have a set of version 2 of the APIs. A question might come to your mind that why do you have two different versions of the same API? Because maybe this is still in progress. This is still in progress. V2 still is in progress, so you're still developing it. So now my question is, I want a separate router to handle v1 APIs and a separate router to handle v2 APIs. How can I do that? Let's see. So inside my routes folder, I'll create a new folder. I will call it as a v1. And I'll create one more folder. I'll call it as v2. Okay, so see, two folders I have kept. And this ping routes, I'm going to move, let's say, to the v1 folder. So can you see now ping routes is inside v1 folder. And I'll rename the file, or let's keep it like this. Inside v2, I'll create a new file, ping routes v2.js. Okay. And I'll copy paste everything here. Now see what's happening. Let's try to think about it. Now what we are saying is that, if at any point of time, any request comes to /API /v1/ping, you go to the ping router, inside v1 routes. Okay. And if a request comes for v2/ping, you go to ping router v2. You go to ping router v2. Ping routes v2. Save it. One second. v2 slash ping routes v2. Okay. And we say ping router v2. Got it? Now you can see similar problem is existing again. We have two different router files, right? We have two different router files. So let's say I'll hard code the controller here. I'll hard code the controller here for a moment. We'll say return rest.json message pinging v2 API. Okay. Cool. And now if let's say you make a call to slash API slash v1 slash ping message, okay, but if you try to make a call to v2 slash ping, you can see message pinging v2 API. Now the problem here again is the same thing, that you are having a lot of app.use. Now just think about it. If let's say there is 1000 v1 APIs, let's say slash API slash v1 slash ping slash API slash v1 slash users slash API slash v1 slash user slash account and so on. So are we going to keeping on bloating our server file index.js file again? No, we don't want that. So we need a more elegant solution here. We need a more elegant solution here. How can we do that? So we will say that, let's say, let's not have multiple routing here. Okay. This is not a good solution. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say that app.use, this is going to help us to make sure that any request that is incoming, we check the URL. So if any request comes up to slash API, any request comes with a URL that starts with slash API, if any request comes with URL starting with slash API, what I'm going to do is I'm going to map it to something like API router, okay, is equals to require. And what I'm going to do inside the routes file, I'm going to create a new file and call it as API router.js. Okay. And I import it here. API router. Can you see what happened? Now I'm just registering slash API with API router. Okay. Slash API with API router. Now what should go inside API router? We'll need the Express app object. We'll say const router is equals to express.router. Express.router. We'll say module.exports router. Okay, cool. So now what I have done is that if any request comes with slash API in the starting, I'm going to redirect all of those requests to API router. Now inside this API router, I can say, now just like this app.use syntax I'm able to see, can I say that we also have a router.use? We also have a router.use. So you can say and call it as API router. Let's call it as API router. You can say API router.use slash v1 and let's require const ping routes or ping router is equals to require dot slash v1 slash ping routes. Okay. And I'll put the ping router here. Now let's see what is happening. What did I say? This is our index.js file. This is the main server file. Here we said that if any incoming request comes starting with slash API, we are going to redirect that request to API router object. API router object knows how to handle the requests. So what we have done here is inside API router object, again, we are using the same .use like syntax. This is a kind of like a middleware. As I earlier mentioned, I'll talk about middlewares in very much in depth. But you can see a similar thing we are doing that we were doing for app.use. That means if a request comes with slash API, whatever is the remaining URL in slash API here, what is the remaining URL? Slash v1 slash ping. So the remaining URL is going to be checked inside API router. In that remaining URL, if the remaining URL starts with slash v1, we are going to make a call to ping router. And inside the ping router, we say that if a request starts with /ping, we are going to call ping controller. Can you guys see? So how the mapping is done? All the API request comes to API router. API router maps it to v1 of the ping router. Ping router maps the ping. So if I send this request, can you see we are getting message okay? And now things are going to be pretty simple. How? Because inside API router, I can say API router.use. If let's say any request comes with /v2, sorry, that is you started with the request as /API, the remaining URL goes to API router. In the remaining URL, it starts with /v2. Then what you can do is you can take the ping router v2 /v2/ping routes v2 and map this ping router v2 here. And if you go inside ping router v2, here we can say /ping. So what happens? If any request starts with /API, you go to API router object. Any request after API starts with v1, you go to ping router. If it starts with v2, you go to ping router v2. Inside ping router v2, now you check after v1 what is the remaining URL. After v1 what is the remaining URL? Ping. So here you go. And now if I change it to /v2, here we go. Now you can see our main server file is not getting bloated. After some time, let's say I want to have the version 3 of the APIs, then again we can have one more dedicated folder v3 and mark the v3 or map v3 here. Right, so you can see properly modularized code. And if anyone has to do any reading, code reading, and they want to check all the v1 APIs, think about it like this. If it's inside this same server file, I would have put all the v1 APIs, all the v2 APIs, all the v3 APIs. People would not have been able to read it properly. But now they can go to the v1 folder and open the v1 folder and see, oh, in the v1, that is if you start with /API, then you go to /v1. Inside v1, you have only registered one route, that is the get request to /ping. So people can very easily read it, right? So this practice actually enhances the code readability at a very high scale, right? And this is what we wanted to achieve as well. Okay, so let's do one thing. Inside ping controller, I'll say function ping controller v2, right? Request, so that I can remove that hard coded controller response, and we can say message okay from v2 API. And this ping controller v2, I'm going to export. And inside API router, we go to ping router v2, and you can see here I have hard coded the controller. I'll put ping controller v2. And now if you see, okay from v2 API, v1, okay, that is okay from v1 API. So I'll just change it from here as well. Okay from v1 API. Okay, okay from v1 API. So this is how you can actually segregate out your routes, and you can see how clean this looks like, right? So we have started exploring the controller layer, but you can see the routes have been segregated version by version. Inside index.js, you just register one API router. That's it. You do not bloat your index.js. Inside API router, you do all the API versionings, very segregated form. And then for each API, you have a corresponding, you can say, URL coming up here as well. And you can even segregate, or I would say even make it more clean. And let me show you how. Now let's say if you want to have an API like this, let's say /API/v1/products. Okay, let's say I want to have this kind of an API. Currently it's not present, so we get a 404. So let's start. We have /API, okay. We have /v1, okay. But can you see, I have mapped everything in v1 to ping router. But technically, what should happen is, there should be a product router.js file. There should be a product router.js file, right? And let's rename this. And this should be your ping router.js file. Can I say that? There should be separate router files, right? There should be separate router files. Can I say that? If you see here, ping router, see? Now, how will you handle that after v1? If something starts with ping, you should go to ping router. And if something starts with products, you should go to product router. How do you handle it? You make another router nested. Let's say I'll make one index.js file. I'll say const express is equals to require express, const router is equals to express dot router, module dot exports. You can say, and let's call it as v1 router, and here I will say inside v1 router dot use, if any request comes to ping, we are going to go to let's get the router. So we'll say const ping router is equals to require dot slash ping router, and we'll say ping router. Cool. And let's say if any request comes to slash products, then we should technically go to product router, products router. Product router. And what should go inside product router? Everything similar to ping router. So I'll copy paste everything from ping router and I will call it as product router. So let's say if any request comes for slash products, okay, any request comes for slash products, let's remove it. I'll have a custom controller for the time being. I'll have a hard coded controller. Later I will segregate it out. We'll say return res.json, let's say products as an empty array for the time being. And now if let's say if I make a request, let's see what happened. Okay, now see, let's start again. So if the request URL starts with slash API, you go to API router. Then in the remaining URL, if the request starts with slash v1, you can see here I'm going to ping router. Now I should not go to ping router. I should technically go to something called as v1 router. And where is v1 router? v1 router is slash v1 slash index. Can I say that? See, let's go here. This is v1 router, right? So you go here and you map everything to v1 router. Okay. And now if you run the code, oh, sorry, one second, let me restart the server. Okay. Some error is coming up. It says router not defined. Okay, one second. So in the product router, I believe there is some issue. Oh, this should be product router. Now if you send the request, okay, again it says not found slash products. Okay. And let's see, slash products, we go to product. Okay, now we don't need a products here. That's good. And you can see we are able to hit our API. So if you see the flow now, what happened? If the request URL starts with slash API, you go to API router. In the remaining URL, if it starts with slash v1, you go to v1 router. Now in the remaining URL, if it starts with slash products, you go to product router. In the remaining URL, if there is nothing, that is just a slash, you're going to call this particular method. So see how deep level of nesting has happened now, right? If let's say now we want to have a post request as well here. Let's say I want to have a post request here as well. I'll just change the method to post and you can see post request also started to work and things are very much segregated, right? Now, any new set of APIs we have to introduce, I will introduce a router corresponding to that and register the router here. So I'll put a comment. Any new API, if we have to introduce, we should just register it here if it is a v1 API. Okay, that's cool. So you can see slash ping goes to ping router, and now you don't need a slash here. So let's say now let's see the flow. If the request URL starts with slash API, you go to API router. In the remaining URL, if you have starting with slash v1, you go to v1 router. In the remaining URL, if you have ping, you go to ping router. In the remaining URL, if you have nothing, you go to ping controller, which returns this. So let's say if I do slash ping, send it. Sorry, it's a get request. You can see everything is working very nice. Okay, so the segregation here is good. The segregation here is good. I'll do the same segregation here as well. Okay, so instead of having ping routes v2, I'll create a new file, index.js. Okay, I'll copy everything from here, paste everything here. This should be v2 router, v2 router, v2 router, v2 router. We don't need a products here. Okay, we don't need this. And dot slash, one second, ping routes v2, ping routes v2, and ping router v2. Okay, ping router v2, ping router v2. Okay, so now let's see how the flow looks like. If you start with slash API, you go to API router. Inside API router, if the remaining URL starts with v2, you go to ping router v2. In ping router v2, here you can see this should be ping router v2. I'm just changing the variable name v2. Okay, and here you should say use that. After you went here, that any URL starts with v2, go to ping v2. Instead of going to ping router v2, we should go to v2 router, right? We should go to v2 router. And where is v2 router? It's here. So now, can you see? If you start with slash API, you go to API router. If the remaining URL starts with v2, you go to v2 router. Inside v2 router, you can see you're inside v2 router. Inside v2 router, if you say in the remaining URL you have a ping, you call ping router v2. And ping router v2 says that, okay, if you have a get request to, sorry, where is this? To the empty URL. That is, after slash ping was detected, you went to ping router v2. And now if in the remaining URL you have nothing, you go to ping URL v2. So technically, if I just change v2 here, everything should work fine. See, we are getting a response from the v2 of the API. So this is how cleaner code practice will work. You have to make very good segregation of the code so that it's more readable. Now you can see if at any point of time, if somebody doesn't care about the v1 API, all they want to debug is the v2 API, they can just come here and whatever main resource they want to target, let's say the ping, they will just start debugging that. Okay. So this is going to be pretty cool. This is going to be pretty cool. Okay. One more standardization that I would like to do is, okay, let's do one thing. So I would like to do one small cleanup, right? I would like to do one small cleanup. Let me segregate that into 2 commits. I'll tell you what cleanup I'm looking at. But for now, I'll say git add all, git commit -m, added router for cleaner routing layer of the project. Okay, git push. So generally, if you go for the recommended way to name the files, the recommended way to name the file doesn't go in camel case form, right? Generally in Node.js project, again, even if you opt for it, it doesn't matter, right? Even if you opt for it, it doesn't matter. Like it's not going to break anything or something like that. But generally, the name of the, I would say files or the folders generally do not go like this, right? So generally we use something called as a kebab case or kebab case, right? How a kebab case generally looks like is something like this. So if you go for a kebab case file name, so it looks something like this. Okay, so the file name should be something like this, descriptive -variable -name. Okay, this kind of a file name we generally look at. So there is a nice Stack Overflow article. I'll bring that here. That Node.js project naming conventions. What are the naming conventions of files and folders in large Node.js projects? So you can see the most upvoted answer. After some years with Node, I can say that there are no conventions, right? However, most professional Express apps use a setup like this, right? And if you see, you can see there is config, models, right? Routes and everything, right? And if you see, let's go here. Regarding the file name, most common are short, lowercase file names. In case your file names can be described with 2 words, most JavaScript projects use a underscore as the delimiter. Okay, so this underscore case is called as a snake case. Snake case. Okay, this kind of a file name. So if you have a file name like this, okay, total underscore snakes underscore found. So instead of hyphen, you can even use snake case, right? Both of the things can actually go. So if you go for, let's say, Airbnb's JavaScript style guide, okay, you can see this is Airbnb's JavaScript style guide. And if you just scroll to, let's say, snake, see, they generally use in Airbnb, they have snake case based file name. See, right? So we can also make our overall project structure with respect to snake case, right? Again, it's not going to break something if you don't do it, but it's a good practice. So I'll start with server config. I'll first of all make server config as snake case. Okay. Let's see if changing the file name is still making the server go up. You can see we are not able to find the config file. Why? Because we have not saved it here. And now you can see server is up. So VS Code will automatically make changes for you. You can see it automatically made server config coming up here. Okay. Let's start with ping controller. If you rename ping controller to something like ping underscore controller. Okay, cool. We don't need this here. And where is ping controller registered? You can see ping controller has been already made underscore. This is good. Then ping router. Let's rename this as well. Ping router. Okay. Let's rename this one as well. Rename. Okay. Product router. So it's good to have good naming conventions and everything used. Rename. Ping router v2. Okay, cool. Save it, and this should go rename API router, API underscore router. I'm just renaming the files, nothing much, and that should be more or less a good to go. If you see, the server is up. Let's try to have some APIs. So if I make an API request to v2, this works. /v1 ping, this works as well. And if you do /products, this works as well. If you make a post request, this works as well. So you can see the naming cleanup is in a good shape. So you can say git add all, git commit -m, renamed files with snake case. Okay. Or let's even do one more thing. I'll add the Airbnb design link for JavaScript standards. One second. Okay, what happened? Okay, git push, origin master. And if you refresh, if you go inside source, you have routes. You can see we have all the segregated routers, and the file names also look absolutely great as well. Right. So this is something that I wanted to majorly discuss.